Hello again, I'm Norm. Thank you very much for joining. Have a seat, settle in, and let my dulcet tones wash away the cares of the day. As a disclaimer, washing away the cares of the day is a short-term fix. You will still need to deal with them. Anyway, once again, this is Norm coming to you in the middle of February. February, one of the avowed gray-brown months. If you are subject to seasonal depression, as most people are to one extent or the other, February tends to be a month mostly spent indoors. That's not to say that there isn't the occasional soggy trudge out to the mailbox or begrudging, resentful trip to the grocery store. But when it comes to voluntary interaction with the environment, many of us prefer to keep that environment as controlled as possible. Now, I don't really have the numbers on this, and I'm certainly too lazy to look it up, but I would assume that February, and the winter months in general, see a lot more video gaming than on around the time of year when it's actually pleasant to go outside. I think that's a safe bet. And if you are a video gamer, if you've been gaming for a while, you probably have your comfort games, the Macaroni and Cheese of the video gaming landscape. Sorry for the awkward pause there. I was just using the term macaroni and cheese as a comfort because it is widely considered a comfort food. But I will go on record right now, just as a mild digression, macaroni and cheese kind of sucks. I don't find it offensive, but I do feel that it has not earned its place as the go-to for comfort food. I'm not saying it needs to do anything spectacular, but I do feel that it should strive to be more than just a noodle-based conveyance for butter and salt. And this isn't a dig on noodle dishes. Look at spaghetti. Spaghetti is every bit the shameful caloric vehicle that macaroni and cheese is, but it's got ambition. You can realistically serve spaghetti on a fifth date without your date feeling like you've stopped trying to impress them. It's still not a particularly high-effort food, but you can marry it with other meats and vegetables without feeling like you're putting on airs. Macaroni and cheese, on the other hand, are the sweatpants of the food kingdom, popularly ascribed comforting properties, but in reality just physical evidence that you've given up. If your idea of comfort involves staying in your pajamas all day, eating a full stick of butter loosely merged with cheese powder and a flour base, what you actually have is clinical depression. You need to get that checked out. Anyway, what I was going to talk about today, talking about virtual environments. Specifically go-to virtual environments for the winter months. Which, because this is something that I do, and I assume that this is something that other people do, I probably shouldn't assume these things. But yes, while the weather is rotten outside and the dream of spring is still far away, I have a number of video games that I use as kind of go-to fill-ins for an actual nice day. And it's important, before I start talking about this, that these environments are not necessarily relative to how I feel about the game in general. That is, having a nice environment doesn't automatically make the game itself good, although obviously it is part of it's part of my personal general assessment with these games, is I do like to have a pleasant environment, but at the same time, you know, I don't deduct a star rating from the Resident Evil series because I don't want to take a vacation there. So basically, I'm talking about these game environments as the environments themselves, not the games overall. Which, not to make this more complicated than it needs to be, in the actual in-game interactions do factor into this. That is, nice scenery is only part of the factor. You need to be able to interact with that environment in some fashion. At the very least, it does factor into the total score. Anyway, I don't want to oversell it because this is not going to be a ranked list of environments. What I'm offering here is more just a list for anybody else who has a rough time during the winter months. Kind of my own personal recommendations of spaces that you can kill a few hours with something more pleasant to look at than a blighted gray landscape of dead trees and caked semi-frozen mud and homeless deer and squirrels hunched over a garbage can fire. Okay, so number one on the list is Watch Dogs 2. Now, I have gone on record elsewhere as saying that Watch Dogs 2 is one of the more underrated games in the pantheon of open world games. Actually, the ratings itself, the ratings themselves have been fairly decent. I think they, when it came out, these were hovering in the 70 to 80 Metascore. It was never considered a major success for Ubisoft, not sales-wise, but the actual reviews, what reviews there were fairly kind to it. I think that there must have been some other major release around the same time that took some of the wind out of its sails, because the quality of the game actually is high enough if you play it now, and I do recommend you play it. As of right now, it actually is still available on Game Pass. Right now, this being February 2023. It is still available on Game Pass if you have not played it before. I do strongly recommend it. The Watch Dogs series, even the first entry, I'll talk a little bit about the first entry in just a moment, because it's a different aesthetic there. But it's got a very, very satisfying gameplay loop. Gameplay revolving around, in addition to your standard open world mechanics running around driving vehicles, but hacking into various objects. A lot of the gameplay is based around kind of the 1990s Angelina Jolie hacker's interpretation of what hacking involves. So it's more or less just like casting magic out of your cell phone. But that gameplay opens up a wide variety of gameplay styles. You can run and gun your way through the series, but a lot of the gameplay puzzles, and I will actually say that they are thought out puzzles by the developers, are engineered in such a way that they can be resolved without direct hand-to-hand or gunplay conflict. You can play about 80 to 90% of the game just by using hacking techniques rather than any kind of hands-on combat, and that itself contributes somewhat to the relaxed nature of the game. Now, like I said, I was going to talk a little bit about the first one just to kind of give you a contrast here, because Watch Dogs 1, well, first off, in relation to what we're talking about today, the environment, Watch Dogs 1 took place in Chicago. And Chicago, while maintaining that kind of large city spectacle, is not in and of itself a pleasant environment. The city is a big, gray, monolithic structures. Your protagonist in Watch Dogs 1 is this guy named Aiden Pierce, who is functionally any random guy that you saw on a video game box cover between 2009 and 2015. Just this mid-30s white guy, permanent scowl, no personality to speak of. He was not there to challenge anyone's perceptions of what a video game action hero could be. Anyway, Watch Dogs 1 was a moderate success for Ubisoft, but I think that even they understood at the time that that even though the gameplay itself was alright, the story, the character, the world, all these elements were lacking somewhat. And so when they went back to the drawing board, and a few years later, they came out with Watch Dogs 2. And one of the reasons that I do consider Watch Dogs 2, to this day, an underrated game, despite my personal feelings about Ubisoft and Ubisoft's general quality of writing, even inside Watch Dogs 2, despite all that, it's because Watch Dogs 2 is such a massive improvement in tone over Watch Dogs 1. They did such a really effective course correction on where the franchise should go. And then they screwed it up entirely with Watch Dogs Legion, but I'll leave that for another day. Because Watch Dogs 1 had a lot of really disparate elements that, when tried to push them all together, came across as fairly disjointed. I'm sure that part of the process in creating this game, Watch Dogs 1, was that the writers were working more or less independent of the people responsible for actually setting up the gameplay systems. And so you've got this kind of deadly serious, grimdark, tragic backstory, generic action hero guy, and his boring revenge story as what's carrying the plot. And then you have the entire gameplay loop, which like literally incorporates this horrible, boring, generic, middle-aged, tragic dad character hacking signposts with literal lolcat memes. Like 100% 2008 grade I Can Has cheeseburger images broadcast onto signposts. And we're supposed to imagine this character like this absolutely devastated, middle-aged Max Payne, lost his wife and child character, like giggling to himself in the back of a van because he made a traffic safety sign say, "All your base are belong to us." Like, ha ha ha, I'm a little imp. And those elements were widely picked on by reviews of the day. Along with one of the other big scandals was the visual downgrade between the E3 demo for Watch Dogs 1 and the eventual real product, but that's irrelevant to this particular conversation. What is relevant is that Watch Dogs 2, for the most part, adopted a much lighter tone. There is one kind of tragic moment that's shoehorned in towards the latter half of the game, but for the most part, it changed out the melodramatic murder revenge story of Watch Dogs 1 and moved it over to a much more lighthearted, youth-focused, sticking it to the corporations plot. For all intents and purposes, it became a video game version of the movie Hackers. And along with the lighter tone, it also moved over to sunny San Francisco. And that alone was a night and day difference for the two games. In Watch Dogs 1, you had cold, gray Chicago where you'd die freezing in an alley. And in Watch Dogs 2, you'd had San Francisco, sunny. You'd still have an unpleasant encounter in an alley, but it'd be like stepping in hobo poop. And the hobo would be a lot nicer about it. And that was a noticeable change, too, in Watch Dogs 2. Actually, I will say, Watch Dogs 2 had some of the best NPC interactions. They were very reactive to almost anything that you were doing in the game world. I would almost put them on par with like Rockstar's NPCs for reactivity. They were very aware of you as the player, but they were also aware of other NPCs. They were frequently getting into fights or sometimes just general conversations with other NPCs. They'd be doing things like, you'd see couples walking in the field, taking selfies with a selfie stick. I didn't say they weren't annoying, I said they were reactive. But the San Francisco environment itself is such a nice, pleasant, in a virtual world where you can't smell the urine. It's sunny, there's greenery all around. You see boats with big white sails out on the bay. And one of the nicest features I have seen for off-mission interaction in a game world, particularly in a game world based on real life, is there is actually an activity in the in-game smartphone where you go around to various tourist locations, to various San Francisco landmarks, real-life landmarks, and take photos of them. And with every photo you take, you actually get a little write-up about that particular item. And it's not all famous landmarks like, the painted ladies, those houses in a row. Sometimes it's just a literal takeoff of some random San Francisco thing, like a guy in a lobster costume who has a real-life analog. It's not the deepest video game open-world side activity out there, but it is a nice little diversion inside a game that encourages you to walk around what is a very pretty environment. They really did put in the effort towards making it a pleasant experience for virtual tourism along with the game that's also there. And if my recommendation for Watch Dogs 2 is not strong enough, let me note that they were made, this game was made by Ubisoft Montreal. That's up in Canada. They know a thing or two about escapism in a winter hellscape environment. In Montreal, their average daytime high for February is 25 degrees. They must have felt like they were designing Disneyland. Anyway, moving on. Didn't really intend to spend that long on Watch Dogs 2. But again, it is a good game. I do heartily recommend if you got Game Pass or if you catch it on sale, because they do have it relatively cheap pretty often now. There's a lot worse things you can have in your library. Anyway, moving on the subject of virtual tourism, second game that I would recommend would be various of the Yakuza series, or the Like a Dragon series, depending on when you hear this, when in the course of its rebranding. Yakuza 0 is my absolute favorite of the bunch, but all of the modern entries are a good time. Now, if you are familiar with the Yakuza series, you may be wondering why I would recommend this for pleasant environments because Yakuza typically does, most of the Yakuza games take place in the winter, and they're taking place in the winter in urban Japan. Which, let's be honest, nobody has ever singled out urban Japan for its beauty. Tokyo, for all the relative popularity of Japan in modern culture, is one ugly, basic city. They've got big, very business-like gray buildings, modern, stark architecture, placed a little too close to everything else. Streets are cramped, people look cold in the winter. It's not a four-season vacation paradise. But what the Yakuza series does that other games really do not do is place a significant focus on exploration and interaction with building interiors. Where most video game cities just have the giant rectangular structures of the buildings themselves and just blank storefronts, Yakuza really has a lot of functioning architecture. It doesn't have the raw square mileage of other open world games, but what area is there is filled up. If you see a restaurant, you can go into the restaurant and order food. Go into an arcade, you can play arcade games. Go into a bowling alley, you can win a chicken. Letting alone what are very often pretty compelling, admittedly soap opera-ish plot lines, the Yakuza series functions exceedingly well as a downtown simulator. For times when you've got the urge to interact with civilization, but you really don't have the willpower to brave the gray muck that it would take to actually reach it, the Yakuza series has your back. Let's see, we're running out of time here. I think I won't bother going real in-depth on any of the other recommendations, but other games like Grand Theft Auto 5, a reasonable simulation of a beachfront with some really nice-looking water, the Dragon Quest games from about 8 onward. Oh, and I would be remiss if I did not mention for the VR-enabled among you, that Vacation Simulator has one of the better simulations of a hotel room that I've seen. Not that I find hotel rooms by themselves all that intriguing, but as a simulation offering the experience of the minutia of poking around a rented room, checking out the limited entertainment amenities and the in-room TV, constantly tuned to the Weather Channel. It's enough to evoke some feelings of nostalgia. Anyway, we've all got our seasonal coping methods. If you've got any interesting ones, any games that you find particularly scratch the itch for better environs during the winter months, go ahead and put them in the comments. I'd be interested to hear them. And no, living in the Southern Hemisphere does not count. All right, let's pad out the last couple minutes with a couple of interesting facts. Fact number 1. Did you know that nutmeg, the popular autumn spice, is in fact a hallucinogen? Nutmeg contains the natural compound myristicin, which when ingested in large quantities has mind-altering effects. So there, if it's early September and your coworkers start talking wistfully about pumpkin spice lattes, it means they're a bunch of dirty junkies. I'm not saying you should report them to the authorities, but it's the responsible thing to do. Finally, did you know that the symbol that we refer to as the pound sign or the hashtag symbol is technically known as an octothorpe? That is octo for the 8 points of the symbol, and thorpe because it is a thorpe. And that is all for today, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you very much for joining me. Please, if you enjoyed today's presentation, like, subscribe, hit the notification button because the subscribe really doesn't do anything unless you do. Leave a comment down below to let the benevolent algorithm spirits know that you are engaged with the content. Alternately, you can help me make the algorithm irrelevant by joining our Patreon. Link is down below in the description. Until next time, y'all take care. Octothorpe, bye-bye. Like the video gamers? We have more such wonders to show you, and all you have to do is subscribe and hit the notifications button.
I mean, you don't have to.
Also consider becoming a patron by following the link to our Patreon page, where we turn your cash into videos, comics, and games using the darkest of dark magics.
But mostly just cash.